Before you test, DNA basics you need to know. Hi, my name is Drew Smith. This is the third and final part of the three-part series about the basics of DNA testing. In this part, we're going to be focused on the remaining types of DNA. We're going to be looking at autosomal DNA and its inheritance pattern, xDNA and its inheritance pattern. We're going to talk briefly about how you use the research problem you have to figure out which type of test or tests to use and who is going to take those tests. And finally, we're going to summarize what's available in terms of the 5 major DNA testing companies and what they offer and how they differ. Autosomal DNA testing, if you remember from a previous part, is part of nuclear DNA testing. In other words, autosomal DNA is part of your nuclear DNA. It consists of the 22 pairs of chromosomes which children get from their parents, one from each parent. In other words, of all the autosomal DNA that a father has and all the autosomal DNA that a mother has, he gives 50% of what he has to each of his children, and the mother does the same. That means that each child gets a different combination from each of their parents. The only difference is going to be if the children are identical twins. Now, DNA inheritance, if it goes like this, where we get autosomal DNA from each of our parents, we know that they got theirs from their parents. In other words, our paternal grandfather gave 50% of his DNA, his autosomal DNA, to his son, our father, and our paternal grandmother gave 50% of her autosomal DNA to her son, our father. You might jump to a conclusion then that you have 25% from each of your paternal grandparents and 25% from each of your maternal grandparents. This isn't exactly true. Why? Because when your father gave you 50% of his own DNA, nothing obligated him to give you exactly half from each of his own parents. He could have given you more from his father and less from his mother, as long as it added up to 50%. Same thing for your mother. She could have given you more from, say, her mother and less from her father, or vice versa. So what's the reality here? Well, the reality is, yes, on average, you get 25% of your own DNA from each of your 4 grandparents, but it can vary. There are cases where someone might have almost a third of their DNA from one particular grandparent. Although keep in mind, that means that the other grandparent of that couple must have given the opposite amount, meaning if one gave 33%, the other had to give only 17%. This really tells us that as we go back generation by generation, there's a range where on average our grandparents gave us 25%, our great-grandparents on average gave us 12.5%. Our great-great-grandparents on average gave us 6.25%. You get the idea. You keep splitting that number in half. But keep in mind also, those are ranges. And within a range, sometimes it means that the result is 0. So what does that really mean in terms of our inheritance from our ancestors, our autosomal DNA? Well, here's the probability that you have some autosomal DNA from all of your ancestors in a particular generation. In fact, if we get back to your 16 great-great-grandparents, it's almost certain that you do carry some amount of DNA, autosomal DNA, from each of those 16. But when you get back another generation to your 3 times great-grandparents, 32 3 times great-grandparents, it's about 50-50 that you will have DNA from all 32. And once you get back to the next generation, 4 times great-grandparents, where there's 64 of them, it's almost certain that at least one or more of those 64 individuals has dropped out of your DNA. You don't have any DNA from them. Does that mean that you're not descended from them? Oh, of course not. One thing we have to understand here is that there's a difference between our genealogical family tree and our genetic family tree. Our genealogical family tree is the one that we're used to working with. It's the one where we've shown through traditional research how we are descended from our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and on back all the way as far as we can tell with paperwork. But if we focus on the genetic family tree, who have we inherited DNA from, we find that, well, typically those trees are the same for several generations back, but once we get far enough back, we start realizing that some of our genealogical ancestors did not become our genetic ancestors, that we just didn't inherit enough of their DNA. So this really kind of tells us that unlike mitochondrial DNA, unlike Y DNA, autosomal DNA is kind of only good so many generations back before it becomes not very useful. And this will be more understandable once we look at matching our cousins. So let's talk about what is the probability that you will match some DNA with one of your, let's say, second cousins or closer. The answer is it's almost certain. You and your second cousins will share some DNA. But what if we talk about third cousins? And it turns out that there begins to be a probability that some among all your third cousins will not share DNA with you. They didn't get the same DNA from your common ancestors with them. As we go to fourth cousins, that probability goes down to 45%. As we go to fifth cousins, down to 15%. And as we get to sixth cousins or beyond, it's less than 5%. Does that mean we'll never match our distant cousins? No, we will match some of them. Of course, as we go out to third, fourth, fifth, and sixth cousins, we should have a lot more of them. But it also means that for most of them, we won't match them through DNA. We didn't get the same DNA from them. Of course, makes it interesting is that our siblings might have. That's why it's very useful in a family to test as many siblings as you can, at least among the oldest generation, because some of them will match these more distant cousins while others will not. But it also gives you an idea that autosomal DNA testing is, again, really only useful for relationships only so far back, because you have to have enough DNA that's shared down both of the lines to see if you do match that person through that process. So let's finish up with our types of DNA by looking at xDNA. Remember, xDNA was also allosomal DNA that we talked about in part 2, but it's the xDNA that is paired with Y DNA for males, and for females, they have 2 X chromosomes. They don't have a Y chromosome. So if you look at the inheritance pattern, where did a male get his X chromosome from? Well, had to be from his mother, because he was busy getting a Y chromosome from his father. So his X DNA comes from his mother. It's a copy of whatever his mother gave him. Women get 2 X chromosomes, one from their fathers, one from their mothers. Although if we think about this for a minute, again focusing on the woman for a moment, although it's true she gets one of her X chromosomes from her own mother, the one she got from her father actually came from his mother. Remember, that's where he got it from. So that means women who have 2 X chromosomes, we could say that they get one from their mother and one from their paternal grandmother. And this really relates to the whole inheritance pattern of xDNA, because it's very different from anything we've seen before. We've seen Y DNA patterns that go all along the patrilineal line as far back as you can imagine. We've seen mitochondrial DNA patterns that go all the way back on the matrilineal line as far back as you can imagine. And we've seen autosomal DNA inheritance that can be on all the lines going back at least several generations. But what would it look like for xDNA inheritance? Well, the answer is complicated, because depending on, let's say we start with a male, so the diagram on the left shows a male in blue, meaning everything in white is on the father's side there on the left, so he could not have inherited any xDNA from his paternal side at all. Remember, he got no xDNA from his father's side, he got a Y chromosome from his father. And if we look on his maternal side, we see his mother and then his grandparents, but we also see that his grandfather got no xDNA from his father, so we can rule out a whole section of ancestry there. What these charts do, is they identify for you who are the possible contributors of xDNA. In other words, if you were to say match xDNA with someone else and you were trying to figure out where the ancestor is that you have in common, you might realize by looking at the chart, well, it's only the people who are marked in color here. But we should also understand that just because you could have inherited some xDNA from any of these ancestors marked as blue or pink doesn't mean you did. And let's talk about what that means. So for example, let's talk about my mother, remembering that she gave me an X chromosome. So what did she do when she gave me an X chromosome? She had two. She had one from her father, one from her mother. What did she do to generate an X chromosome that she gave to me? Well, as it turns out, about 86% of the time when a woman gives an X chromosome to their child, it's a mixture of the two X chromosomes that the mother has. So she's mixing those two X chromosomes that she has, producing a single X chromosome, which she then gives to the child. But that's 86% of the time. What about the other 14%? Well, we'll split it in 7 and 7. 7% of the time, she simply gives a copy of the one she got from her father, just as it was. And 7% of the time, she gives her child a copy of the one she got from her mother, just as it was. So that means that when that happens, the child is not getting anything from the other side of the family. So those things do happen, and that's what it means when we say that these charts tell you where xDNA could possibly come from, but does not say that it does come from these ancestors. Just had to come from some of them. Now that we've looked at the inheritance patterns of all of the types of DNA, of mitochondrial, of Y-DNA, of autosomal DNA and xDNA, and we should point out xDNA is automatically tested. It's not a separate test. It is tested as part of an autosomal DNA test. So what test should be taken? Well, you know, in genealogy, when we have a research problem, when we have a brick wall, when we have a question, what that question, problem, brick wall is tells us what records we should be looking at. It tells us, perhaps in the case of, geography or the time frame, certain records that are going to help us. Well, DNA testing is very similar. First, you have to start with what's the question or the problem. Now, that doesn't mean that it isn't a good idea to go ahead and do some DNA testing when you first get involved in genealogy, because after all, you want to make sure you test people while they're still alive, and you may want to get some of your oldest ancestors to test. We'll come back to that idea. But the point is that normally you have a particular question, and therefore your question is going to address what type of DNA test to take, because now we know what the inheritance patterns are. If I have a question or problem about my father's family, I know that I shouldn't bother taking a mitochondrial test because that's only about my matrilineal line. And the same thing if I have a question about my mother's family, there's no point in my taking a Y-DNA test to try to solve that because that's only from my father's line, particularly my patrilineal line. So I have to use these DNA inheritance patterns to help me figure out what type of test should be taken. And sometimes it's multiple types. Sometimes it's an autosomal and a Y-DNA, or an autosomal and a mitochondrial. You just don't know until you understand what your question is. Also, it was mentioned earlier in this three-part series, sometimes you have to figure out who's going to take the test. It may not even be you. For example, as I said, if I'm interested in my Smith surname, I can take a Y-DNA test because I carry the Y chromosome. But if it's my Martin family, my mother's family that I'm more interested in, I can't take a Y-DNA test that's going to tell me anything about the Martin family, but my Martin cousins, my male Martin cousins, could take that test. In terms of autosomal, it is usually better to get someone from the oldest generation because, as you've seen from the inheritance patterns, every generation we're basically losing 50% of the DNA. So if you're trying to test and match some of these more distant cousins, you want your oldest relatives to test. This could be, in your own case, perhaps a parent or grandparent. It could be say a great aunt or great uncle, or an aunt or an uncle, depending on who is still alive. In some cases, you may be the oldest generation, and that means that you yourself, and perhaps your siblings, if you have siblings, are the ones that should take the autosomal test. And perhaps your first cousins and some of your second cousins would be helpful too. Depending on the kind of question or problem you're trying to resolve here, you may need to take multiple tests. And you might need to have multiple test takers, as I said, you and your siblings, or your aunts and your uncles and your parents. Let's look quickly at the 5 major DNA testing companies. Ancestry DNA and 23andMe are probably the best known. They do the most advertising. And in fact, if you do not test with them, you cannot get into their test database. They require you to take their own test. But they are the largest, therefore the best chance of matching other people is if you test with Ancestry DNA or 23andMe, and certainly you can test with both. They only offer the autosomal test, and you spit into a tube. Family Tree DNA, I've already mentioned, actually provides all kinds of tests, autosomal, Y-DNA, and mitochondrial. MyHeritage and Living DNA are also test companies. They provide autosomal testing. That's the only type they provide as well. Another option here is that the type of tests may require how you do the test differently. With Ancestry DNA and 23andMe, you spit into a tube, while with Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and Living DNA, you scrape some cells from the inside of the cheek. Saliva-based tests can be difficult for some people, especially the elderly. They may not have enough saliva they can generate for the tests that Ancestry and 23andMe offers. However, there are instructions online for how to increase the amount of saliva that a test taker needs to take. So I wouldn't rule out having your older relatives take an Ancestry or 23andMe test just because they might be having some difficulties with generating spit. And in fact, some of the companies will automatically send you another test if the first one is inconclusive and didn't work. One more point I think needs to be made here is that you can transfer data from any of these companies to Family Tree DNA, to MyHeritage, or to Living DNA. So if you test it with Ancestry or test it with 23andMe, you can download your data, same thing with the other 3 companies, and then transfer it into those other companies to be part of their database. So that puts you into all of the ponds, as we say, that you want to fish in. Unfortunately, you cannot transfer your data into Ancestry DNA or 23andMe. So to summarize, all the major companies offer an autosomal test. That includes the xDNA testing. These tests are going to match you to usually lots of other people, and depending on who they are, they will be listed from the closest matches to the more distant matches. We could be talking about hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of matches. And the nice thing about autosomal testing is that it can answer questions along all your lines. It's not limited to being tested for matrilineal, patrilineal. It covers all of your lines several generations back. So I hope you enjoyed this 3-part series. Good luck with your DNA testing.